My name is Samantha Wilson. I'm 32 years old, and until a few months ago, I thought I had a stable marriage. For 7 years, I stood by my husband, Michael, through every struggle, every setback, and every promise of a brighter tomorrow. While he drifted in and out of jobs, I kept our life afloat with my career in marketing. I worked overtime, took on clients I didn't enjoy, and carried the weight of our household on my shoulders, all because I believed in him. Before I go deeper into my story, let me pause for just a moment. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe because what comes next is proof that karma has a strange way of balancing the scales. What Michael never knew, or maybe never cared to admit, was that one of the strongest connections in my life wasn't with him, but with his father, Edward. Edward and I understood each other in a way Michael and I never truly did. He admired my drive, my discipline, and the way I treated every dollar with respect. Michael, on the other hand, saw it as competition. He resented the bond I shared with his father, though he rarely said it outright. Then Edward died, and with his death came a revelation that none of us were prepared for. Michael inherited $62 million. Just like that, our lives changed overnight, or so I thought. What really happened was far more complicated, far uglier. The man I had once loved turned into someone unrecognizable in the span of a single afternoon. I still remember the look on his face when the will was read. The performance of grief he had put on at the funeral evaporated in an instant. He didn't even try to hide his excitement. He squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt, grinning as though every dream had just fallen into his lap. And then, within days, everything began to unravel. The man I had cooked for, prayed for, supported through endless disappointments, looked me straight in the eye and said words that will never leave me. "You're useless to me now." With that, he threw me out of the home I had built with him, the marriage I had nurtured, and the future I thought we shared. But what Michael didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his father had prepared for this very moment. Edward had seen something in his son that Michael refused to see in himself: arrogance, entitlement, and a lack of responsibility. He also saw something in me, and what he left behind would become the key to the greatest twist of my life. I wasn't born into money. My family in Connecticut lived a modest, middle-class life. My parents worked hard, often sacrificing their own wants so that my brother and I could have more opportunities than they ever did. They drilled into me the value of responsibility, honesty, and financial independence. When I went to college, I chose business management not because it sounded glamorous, but because it made sense. Numbers always spoke to me. I had a knack for understanding balance sheets, budgets, and how money could either be wasted or multiplied. While my friends partied, I was the one they asked to help with student loans or to explain why their credit cards were always maxed out. Deep down, I wanted to build my own consulting business someday, a place where I could help others manage their finances with confidence. But when I met Michael, that dream got pushed aside. It was at a friend's birthday party. Michael stood out the moment I saw him, that charismatic smile, the way he commanded attention in every room. He seemed larger than life. Handsome, charming, and filled with stories about his ambitions in architecture. He told me that night, "Architecture is about creating spaces that change how people feel. I want to design buildings that inspire people." His passion was magnetic. I believed every word. When he approached me with 2 glasses of wine and said, "Let me save you from this boring conversation," I laughed harder than I had in months. That was Michael. He made the world seem brighter, more exciting. And after just 6 months of dating, he got down on one knee during a weekend trip to a quiet beach town. The ring wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful to me. I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was small, intimate, and filled with laughter. Looking back, though, the warning signs were already there. Michael couldn't seem to hold a job. During our short courtship, he had switched employers twice, always blaming toxic managers or companies that didn't recognize his talent. I brushed it off, convinced his big break was just around the corner. But that break never came. Instead, I worked longer hours, climbed the ladder in my firm, and told myself it was only temporary. Michael promised me, "When my career takes off, I'll take care of you the way you deserve." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. It wasn't until I met Edward, his father, that I started to sense the truth. Edward was intimidating at first glance. Successful, direct, and not someone who wasted words. Michael had warned me that his father was impossible to please, so I braced myself for criticism. But instead, Edward welcomed me with unexpected warmth. He asked about my career. He listened. He challenged me with questions about the future and offered advice I hadn't even asked for. After dinner, he took me to his study, showing me shelves of business books he had collected over decades. "You understand financial responsibility," he told me that night. "That's something I've tried to teach Michael for years." It was the beginning of a bond that grew stronger with time. Michael hated it. He saw our connection as a betrayal. He accused me of trying to impress his father, of stealing the attention that should have been his. He never understood that Edward valued me not because I was smarter or better, but because I cared enough to listen and learn. As the years passed, Edward became more than a father-in-law. He became a mentor. Every Sunday, dinner turned into a miniature seminar on business, investments, and the discipline it takes to turn money into legacy. He told me once, "You remind me of myself when I was younger. The only difference is you have empathy to balance your ambition." Those words stayed with me. They became a lifeline when everything else began to collapse. When Edward was diagnosed with terminal cancer, my world tilted. I threw myself into helping with hospital visits, medications, and appointments. Michael? He played the grieving son when others were around, but in private, he checked his phone, made excuses, and left early. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and in Edward's final weeks, he asked to speak to me alone. His body was frail, but his eyes were sharp, almost piercing. "Thank you," he told me, his voice hoarse but steady. "You've been the daughter I never had, and you've shown me what true character looks like." I didn't know it then, but he was leaving me more than just words. When Edward passed, I was holding his hand. "Michael?" He arrived 20 minutes too late, delayed at a coffee shop. I promised Edward in those last moments that I would honor his memory. I had no idea then just how prophetic that promise would become. At the funeral, people came up to me, not Michael, and said things like, "Edward thought of you as family." I saw the jealousy in Michael's eyes, though he masked it behind a dry smile and a folded handkerchief. 2 days later, the will was read. That was the day my marriage and my entire life changed forever. The lawyer's office was crowded, heavy with silence. The blinds were half drawn, letting in narrow beams of afternoon light that cut across polished wood furniture. Michael sat beside me, his leg bouncing with restless energy. His hand gripped mine so tightly that my fingers felt numb. It was supposed to be a moment of mourning, of remembering a man who had lived a remarkable life. But for Michael, it was a lottery ticket waiting to be scratched. The lawyer, a thin man with glasses perched low on his nose, shuffled through thick folders. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and began to read aloud the last words of Edward's estate. "To my son, Michael Wilson, I leave..." Michael leaned forward, his eyes wide, lips parting in anticipation. "The sum of $62 million. Michael inhaled sharply, then exhaled as if he had just won the Super Bowl. His shoulders straightened. His face broke into a grin so wide I barely recognized him. The lawyer continued reading, listing various smaller bequests to charities, old business partners, and even staff who had served Edward for decades. But I barely heard a word of it. My mind was frozen on Michael's reaction. This wasn't grief. This wasn't respect for a man who had shaped so many lives. This was raw, selfish greed, laid bare for everyone in that room to see. When the papers were finally signed and sealed, Michael didn't bother to thank the lawyer. Instead, he tugged at my arm, urging me toward the exit. The moment we were in the parking lot, he let out a yell, pumping his fist in the air like a man possessed. "We're rich, Samantha. Do you hear me? Rich!" I forced a smile, though something inside me cracked. I wanted to be happy, but Edward's face kept flashing in my mind. He had always spoken of wealth as a responsibility, a tool to be used wisely. And here was his only son, dancing in the parking lot like a child who had found candy. I whispered to myself, "Edward, I'm so sorry." That night, Michael ordered champagne, expensive takeout, and spent hours pacing the living room while rattling off ideas. We'll buy a penthouse downtown. No, scratch that. 2 penthouses. One for us and one for when friends visit. I'll get the sports car I always wanted, maybe a Ferrari. And we'll travel. Europe, Asia, anywhere we want. He wasn't talking about us. He was talking about him. When I tried to remind him of Edward's values, Michael cut me off. Don't lecture me, Samantha. I'm the one who inherited the money. You didn't earn it. I did. The words stung. More than that, they revealed something deeper, a wedge I hadn't realized was already there. Days turned into weeks. Michael stopped working entirely. He hadn't been consistent before, but now he dismissed the idea of a job with a laugh. Why should I slave away for someone else when I'm sitting on millions? He started surrounding himself with people I'd never seen before. Old acquaintances suddenly reappeared, each with smiles a little too wide and compliments a little too polished. Michael welcomed them all, throwing lavish parties in rented venues, handing out expensive watches as if they were party favors. I stood in the background, watching my husband burn through his inheritance like fire-consuming dry grass. And then came the day he turned on me. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned from work, exhausted after a client presentation. Michael was sprawled across the couch, scrolling through his phone, music blasting from the new sound system he'd bought. I asked him calmly, "Did you make any plans for handling the estate? Investments? Trusts? Anything?" He looked at me with disdain. "You're useless to me now, Samantha. I don't need you watching over my shoulder anymore. You're not entitled to a cent of this money. This is mine. And if you think otherwise, maybe it's time you pack your things." I froze. The man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed for, was gone. In his place stood someone unrecognizable. That night, I sat alone in the guest room, my mind racing. I thought about the years I had spent carrying him, the overtime hours, the sleepless nights, the way I had shielded him from his own failures. And now, cast aside like a discarded piece of furniture. But then, a memory surfaced. Edward's final days, the private conversation we had shared in the hospital room, when he had gripped my hand and whispered words that now rang with new meaning. "You've been the daughter I never had, and I want you to know, you'll be taken care of." At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. A blessing, a reassurance. But what if he had meant more? A week later, I received a letter in the mail. My name, handwritten in careful script, stood out against the white envelope. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a short note from Edward's lawyer. "Per Mr. Wilson's request, please contact me at your earliest convenience regarding private matters not disclosed in the official reading of the will." My breath caught. Private matters? That night, while Michael drowned in champagne and shallow laughter at yet another party, I lay awake in bed with the letter clutched to my chest. Something told me Edward hadn't just left his legacy to his reckless son. Something told me my story was only beginning. The following morning, I called the lawyer. His tone was calm, measured as he asked me to come to the office alone. When I arrived, he handed me a sealed envelope. "Mr. Wilson left this specifically for you, Samantha. He insisted it be kept confidential." With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a letter written in Edward's steady, familiar handwriting. It began simply, "Samantha, if you are reading this, then my concerns about Michael have unfortunately proven correct." And that was the moment I realized. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been chosen. The letter trembled in my hands as I read it line by line. Edward's handwriting was neat, deliberate, each stroke carrying the weight of intention. "Samantha, if you are reading this, it means my doubts about Michael's ability to manage responsibility have unfortunately come true. I fear his inheritance will destroy him rather than build him, but I have always believed in you. That is why I have set aside something that is yours alone." I paused, blinking as though the words might change if I looked again. "Enclosed in this letter, you will find the key to a safe deposit box. Its contents are for you and you alone. No one else knows of this. Not Michael, not even the rest of my legal team. You are free to use what you find there however you see fit. Consider it not just a gift, but a responsibility. I trust you will do what is right." My breath caught. My palms grew slick with sweat. At the bottom of the envelope was a small metallic key with a number engraved on it. The lawyer leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "He made me promise to deliver this directly to you. I haven't seen what's inside." I nodded, tucking the key into my purse as though it were a fragile treasure. My mind was spinning. What could Edward have left for me that was so secret, so personal that even his own son was kept in the dark? The following Saturday, I drove to the bank listed on the envelope. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive felt endless, every red light a test of patience, every turn weighted with anticipation. When I finally arrived, I was led into a private vault room. A bank officer retrieved the box associated with my key and placed it on the table before leaving me alone. For a moment, I just stared at it. My reflection stared back from the polished steel. My heart raced. I whispered to myself, "Whatever this is, it changes everything." With shaky fingers, I unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly stacked and bound, were files. Dozens of them. Financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. But at the very top was a letter sealed in a cream-colored envelope. I tore it open and began to read. "Samantha, these are assets I have accumulated quietly over the years. Properties, accounts, and investments separate from my official estate. Their total value is approximately $24 million. They now belong to you." I gasped, nearly dropping the paper. My knees weakened and I sank into the chair. 24 million. My entire life I had scraped and saved, dreaming of financial stability, of building something for the future. And here, hidden away, was a fortune entrusted solely to me. "Use this wisely," Edward's letter continued. "Not for extravagance, but for purpose. I give this to you because I know you will treat it with respect. Do not tell Michael. He will not understand, and it will destroy what remains of him. This is between us." Tears blurred my vision. For years, I had felt invisible in my marriage, unappreciated for the sacrifices I made. Yet Edward had seen me. He had understood. And now, even in death, he was giving me something my husband never had: trust. The drive home was a blur. My mind replayed Edward's words over and over. I couldn't tell Michael. That much was clear. When I walked into the house, Michael barely noticed. He was too busy laughing with two men I didn't recognize. Champagne bottles littering the coffee table. I could smell the expensive cigars burning in the air. "Babe," he called out, slurring slightly. "We're talking about buying a yacht. Can you imagine? Us, sailing the Mediterranean like royalty." I forced a smile, excused myself, and hurried upstairs, clutching the documents in my bag. That night, as Michael snored beside me, I spread the files across the bed in the guest room. Properties in New York, Florida, and even overseas. Stocks and companies I'd only dreamed of investing in. Bonds, trusts, accounts with balances that made my head spin. I whispered into the silence, "Edward, I won't let you down." But with that promise came fear. What if Michael found out? What if his greed consumed this hidden legacy too? The thought alone was enough to make me lock the files in a small safe I had bought years ago, one Michael had never bothered to ask about. The next morning, Michael was already gone when I came downstairs. He had taken one of the new sports cars he'd impulsively purchased. A note scribbled on the counter read, "Out with the guys. Don't wait up." I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee slowly, staring at the sunlight streaming through the window. On the outside, I was still the dutiful wife, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't powerless. Later that week, I met with Edward's lawyer again. We spoke in hushed tones in his office, the blinds drawn for privacy. "This inheritance," I asked cautiously, "it's fully legal? Michael can't contest it?" He shook his head. Edward was very careful. "These assets were separate, in your name, designated long before his passing. There is no legal ground for anyone else to claim them." Relief washed over me, mingled with guilt. I thought of Michael, wasting millions while I sat on a hidden treasure. Should I feel guilty? Or was this karma finally evening the scales? The lawyer's voice broke my thoughts. Samantha, Edward trusted you. Don't take that lightly. I nodded. I won't. That evening, Michael returned home in a whirlwind. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath heavy with alcohol. He tossed his jacket onto the couch and sneered. You're still working? Why, we don't need your stupid job anymore. Quit already. Focus on being my wife. His words, once merely selfish, now felt venomous. I smiled thinly and replied, I'll think about it. Inside, though, my thoughts were very different. You may think I'm powerless, Michael, but one day you'll see just how wrong you are. Over the next few weeks, I lived two lives. In public, I was the supportive wife, nodding politely at Michael's endless parade of parties and indulgences. In private, I was building something entirely different. I began studying Edward's files, analyzing investments, learning how to manage properties, planning a future that no one else could touch. I felt alive again. For years, I had been tethered to Michael's failures. Now, for the first time, I had the power to write my own story. And yet, a question haunted me. When Michael eventually discovered the truth, and I knew he would, what would happen then? At first, Michael's spending spree seemed almost amusing, like watching a child let loose in a candy store. He was giddy, impulsive, restless. Every day brought another delivery, another extravagant purchase, another shallow attempt to fill the void Edward's death had left behind. The garage, once home to our modest sedan, now looked like a showroom. A cherry red Ferrari, a sleek black Lamborghini, a convertible Porsche in metallic silver. He lined them up proudly, taking endless selfies for social media, captioned hashtags like #livingthedream and #millionaireLife. I watched silently, sipping my coffee as he posed in designer sunglasses, convinced the world admired him. But behind the flashy smile, his eyes carried a hunger that nothing seemed to satisfy. The parties grew bigger, louder, and more vulgar. Strangers filled our home, their laughter echoing through the halls until dawn. Bottles of champagne popped like gunshots. Music shook the walls. Women I'd never met draped themselves over Michael as though I wasn't even in the room. When I confronted him, his response was sharp, dismissive. Don't act jealous, Samantha. This is what success looks like. Learn to enjoy it. Success? I wanted to scream. This wasn't success, it was destruction wrapped in glitter. But I said nothing. Not yet. Privately, I began slipping away from his world of chaos. Each night, after the last guest stumbled out and Michael collapsed into bed, I would retreat into the guest room and pore over Edward's files. Property deeds, bank accounts, investment records. I created spreadsheets, categorized assets, and mapped out strategies. It was as though Edward had handed me the pieces of a puzzle, trusting me to put them together. And I did. Slowly, I began moving pieces into motion. I transferred small amounts into accounts Michael didn't know existed. I contacted property managers listed in the files, quietly reintroducing myself as the legal owner. Each step was small, deliberate, invisible to Michael's careless gaze. It was exhilarating. For years, I had felt like a passenger in my own life, dragged along by Michael's whims. Now, for the first time, I was behind the wheel. But the more control I gained, the more Michael seemed to unravel. One evening, he returned home with 3 strangers, all carrying shopping bags from luxury stores. He tossed them onto the couch and grinned. Picked up a few things for my boys, he said, handing out designer watches worth more than most people's annual salaries. I stared at him in disbelief. Michael, you can't just give away money like this. Do you realize how fast you're burning through the inheritance? He sneered. You wouldn't understand. This is what loyalty looks like. These guys are my friends. Friends? I wanted to laugh. They weren't friends, they were parasites circling him like vultures. But I bit my tongue. Let him drown in his illusions. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. A few weeks later, the cracks became impossible to ignore. The first phone call came from the bank. Michael had overdrawn one of his accounts by $500,000 after placing a down payment on a yacht. The second came from a luxury dealership demanding payment for a Rolls Royce he had forgotten to finalize. When I tried to reason with him, he exploded. "Don't you dare lecture me about money, Samantha. I'm rich. I'll always be rich. You should be grateful I let you live in this lifestyle at all." His words were like knives. Once, I might have cried. But now, with Edward's hidden fortune quietly building under my control, I simply nodded and walked away. Inside, a small flame of defiance burned brighter. Around this time, I began making my first independent moves. I invested in a small property just outside the city, a modest apartment building Edward had purchased years ago. It had been neglected, tenants frustrated by lack of maintenance. I hired a local management company, authorized repairs, and began turning it into something livable again. Within 3 months, rent payments increased. Tenants sent thank you notes. The building began generating steady income. It wasn't about the money. It was about the power of creating something stable, something real. Unlike Michael, who burned through his inheritance like gasoline on fire, I was building foundations brick by brick. For the first time, I didn't just hope for a better future. I was creating it. But Michael wasn't blind. One night, as I was reviewing property statements at my desk, he stumbled into the room, half drunk. His eyes narrowed at the papers spread across the table. "What are you doing?" he slurred. "Work," I said calmly, sliding the documents into a folder. He snorted. "Work? You don't need to work anymore. I told you to quit. Why do you keep acting like you know better than me?" I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because someone in this house has to." His face twisted with rage. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but instead he laughed bitterly and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sat in silence, my heart pounding. That was the night I realized something. Michael didn't just resent me. He feared me. Because deep down he knew. He knew that no matter how much money he spent, no matter how many toys he bought, I was the one truly in control. The turning point came weeks later. Michael announced he was flying to Las Vegas with his friends for what he called a business trip. I knew better. It was another binge, another reckless adventure with people who cared only for his wallet. As he packed, he smirked at me. "Don't wait up, sweetheart. Try not to miss me too much." When the door shut behind him, I stood in the quiet house, the weight of decision pressing down on me. This was my chance. For too long, I had lived in his shadow. For too long, I had sacrificed while he squandered. Edward hadn't trusted Michael with his legacy. He had trusted me. And now it was time I started acting like the woman Edward believed I was. I walked into the guest room, opened the safe, and laid out Edward's files once more. This wasn't just money. It was freedom. And I intended to use it. The house was quiet without Michael. For years, his absence had left me anxious, wondering what trouble he might bring home. But now, with Edward's hidden fortune at my disposal, I felt something entirely new. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting by the phone. I wasn't pacing the floor or checking the clock. Instead, I sat in the guest room with my laptop open, spreadsheets glowing on the screen, and a new sense of clarity guiding my every decision. Michael was out chasing his illusions in Las Vegas. I was here, building something real. That week, I expanded my efforts. I contacted Edward's longtime investment advisor, a discreet man named Mr. Lowell who had handled many of the accounts listed in the files. We met in his private office, far from the flash and noise of Michael's world. "You've inherited something rare," Mr. Lowell told me, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the documents I'd brought. Edward was a cautious man, but he had an uncanny instinct for opportunity. He positioned you well. I leaned forward, listening intently as he explained strategies, options, and long-term plans. He spoke to me as an equal, not as Michael did, dismissing me, but as someone capable of understanding and making decisions. By the end of the meeting, I had authorized several small, calculated moves, investments Edward had identified but never acted upon. They weren't glamorous, they wouldn't earn me applause on social media, but they were solid, stable, the kind of choices that built empires quietly, brick by brick. As I signed the final paper, a strange feeling swept over me. Not fear, not doubt. Power. Meanwhile, Michael was spiraling. Photos began surfacing online. Him surrounded by strangers in expensive suits, half-dressed women clinging to his arm, casino chips stacked high in front of him. He posted videos of himself tossing $100 bills in the air, laughing as if money were confetti. At first, people liked and shared. They envied him. They praised him. But admiration is fragile and envy is sharp. Within weeks, the comments shifted. Strangers mocked him for being reckless, for flaunting wealth he hadn't earned. Rumors spread that he was borrowing money from acquaintances, losing more than he won. Some even whispered that casinos had begun refusing his credit. His so-called friends? They were the first to sense the shift. One by one, they stopped returning his calls, leaving him with empty bottles and unpaid bills. When Michael finally returned from Las Vegas, he was a shadow of the man who had left. His smile was forced, his swagger hollow. He stumbled into the house late one night, his eyes bloodshot, his suitcase half empty. "Rough trip?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral. He glared at me, dropping the suitcase on the floor. "Don't start." I didn't. I simply watched as he disappeared upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind him. Part of me wanted to feel pity. Another part of me, the part that remembered every insult, every betrayal, every sacrifice, felt nothing but cold detachment. Michael had chosen his path, and I had chosen mine. Over the next month, the gap between us grew wider. Michael still tried to maintain appearances, throwing smaller parties, buying gifts for the few hangers-on who hadn't abandoned him yet. But his credit was stretched thin. Collectors began calling the house. He ignored them, convinced his luck would turn around. I, on the other hand, was thriving quietly. The apartment building I had restored was fully rented, producing steady income. One of Edward's offshore accounts, when restructured, began generating returns beyond what I expected. My secret balance grew stronger each day. For years, Michael had treated me like a liability, a burden he carried. But in truth, I had become the only one in this marriage who could stand on her own 2 feet. It wasn't long before Michael noticed the difference. One evening, as I was reviewing reports at the kitchen table, he wandered in, glass of whiskey in hand. He leaned against the counter, studying me with narrowed eyes. "You've been busy," he said slowly. I didn't look up. I like keeping myself occupied. He chuckled bitterly. "Funny, you never used to care about this stuff. Now you act like you're the one running things." I closed my laptop and met his gaze. Maybe I am. For a moment, silence stretched between us. His jaw tightened. He wanted to say something cruel, something cutting, but instead he finished his drink in one swallow and stormed out. It was in that silence, in his retreat, that I realized something profound. Michael wasn't just reckless. He was afraid. Afraid of me. That fear grew more obvious as weeks passed. He began asking subtle questions. Where I went during the day, who I met with, what I was doing on my laptop at night. His curiosity wasn't born from care. It was suspicion. He could feel the balance of power shifting, even if he couldn't prove it. And in his world, power was everything. One night, long after Michael had gone to bed, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at Edward's files once again. My hand rested on the letter he had written. His final words to me. "I trust you will do what is right." Those words echoed in my mind. They weren't just a gift. They were a challenge. I wasn't just protecting money. I was protecting my future. And I knew sooner or later, Michael would try to take it from me. But I was ready. For the first time in years, I wasn't the powerless wife in the background. I was the one holding the cards. The phone calls began as a nuisance. At first, Michael would laugh them off. Bank representatives, credit card companies, dealerships demanding payment. He brushed them aside as though they were mosquitoes, swatting without care. But soon the calls multiplied. Collectors became more aggressive. Letters arrived in thick envelopes, stamped in bold red ink. I watched him tear them open with shaking hands, muttering curses under his breath, before shoving them into drawers he never emptied. It wasn't just nuisance anymore. It was collapse, creeping closer every day. One evening, I found him pacing the living room, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp, defensive. "Don't talk to me like that. I'll have the money I told you. Just give me another week." He ended the call abruptly, his face pale, sweat glistening at his temples. When he noticed me standing at the doorway, he barked, "What are you staring at?" "Nothing," I said evenly. But inside, I felt something between satisfaction and dread. Michael was drowning in the very ocean he'd filled with his greed, and he had no idea I was already swimming to shore. His so-called friends abandoned him entirely. The men who once drank his liquor, wore the watches he bought them, rode in his cars, they stopped answering his calls. The women who clung to him at parties disappeared the moment the money dried up. He was left alone, sitting in a mansion that felt emptier by the day. That emptiness drove him mad. One night, he stumbled in at 2 a.m, his shirt untucked, eyes bloodshot. He reeked of whiskey. "Do you know what loyalty is, Samantha?" He slurred, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Loyalty is staying with someone when things get tough. But you just sit there, judging me, waiting for me to fail." I met his gaze, calm, unwavering. "I don't have to wait, Michael. You're failing all on your own." His face twisted in rage. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he grabbed a glass from the counter and hurled it against the wall, shattering it into pieces. Then he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I sat in silence, staring at the broken glass. And in that silence, a decision crystallized. I needed to protect myself, not just financially, but physically, emotionally. Michael was unraveling, and I could no longer trust what he might do next. The next morning, while he slept off his rage, I took careful steps. I met with a lawyer. Not Edward's this time, but one of my own choosing. I asked quiet, precise questions about separation, about securing assets, about protecting myself legally. The lawyer, a sharp woman with eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward and said, "You need to prepare for the worst. Men like him don't go down gracefully." Her words chilled me, but they also steeled me. By the time I left her office, I had a plan. At home, Michael grew more desperate. He sold one of the cars, an act that must have wounded his pride deeply. But instead of using the money to pay debts, he squandered it in a week, chasing the illusion of a comeback. His arrogance blinded him. He still strutted around, talking about deals and investments that didn't exist, as though words alone could restore his crumbling empire. But behind closed doors, I watched him sweat. I watched him sit at the desk, head in his hands, staring at bills he couldn't pay. And I realized something shocking. For the first time in our marriage, Michael needed me. He approached me one night, softer than usual, almost pleading. "Samantha," he said, his voice low, "you've always been good with numbers. Maybe you could help me, just until I get back on my feet." I studied him carefully. The arrogance was still there, but beneath it was fear. Desperation. "Help you?" I asked, my tone measured. He nodded quickly. "You're my wife. That's what wives do, right? They support their husbands." I wanted to laugh at the irony. For years, I had supported him, sacrificing my own dreams while he burned through every opportunity. And now, when he had nothing left, he came crawling. But I didn't laugh. I smiled faintly and said, "I'll think about it." Because the truth was, I had no intention of saving him. I was saving myself. Behind the scenes, I accelerated my plans. I began moving Edward's assets into more secure accounts beyond Michael's reach. I met discreetly with advisors, signing documents he would never see. I even started scouting apartments in the city, places where I could start fresh once the time came. Each step brought me closer to freedom. Each step reminded me that Edward had trusted me for a reason. Meanwhile, Michael's debts became dangerous. One night, 2 men showed up at the house, strangers in dark suits, their expressions hard. They asked for Michael. When I told them he wasn't home, they exchanged a look that made my stomach knot. "Tell him," one said coldly, "time's running out." They left without another word. I stood frozen in the doorway, heart pounding. It was no longer just about wasted money. Michael was in deeper than I'd imagined. And when men like that came calling, the consequences were never just financial. That night, as Michael snored in a drunken haze beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. This was the tipping point. I couldn't wait for him to destroy himself completely. If I stayed too long, he would drag me down with him. Edward had given me the tools to survive, to thrive, and I owed it to myself and to Edward's trust not to squander that gift. In the darkness, I whispered a promise only I could hear. This ends with me. I will not go down with him. The first time the men came, they left with a warning. The second time, they weren't so polite. It was late evening. I was sitting in the living room, reading through property statements when a sharp knock rattled the door. The sound carried a weight that made my stomach sink. Two men stood on the porch, different from the ones before, but the same aura of danger clung to them. Broad shoulders, cold eyes, suits too sharp to be ordinary. "Is Michael home?" one asked, his voice flat. I swallowed hard. "No, he's not here." The man's gaze flicked past me into the house as though measuring its worth. Then he leaned closer. "Tell him the clock's ticking. If he doesn't pay what he owes, we collect another way." My skin crawled. Another way. The implication was clear. Before I could respond, they turned and walked into the night, leaving me trembling in the doorway. When Michael finally stumbled in hours later, drunk and careless, I confronted him. "Men came here again," I said sharply. "They're not joking anymore. How much do you owe them?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about it. I've got it under control." Under control? My voice rose, anger bubbling. "Michael, they're threatening us. They're threatening me. How much did you lose?" He rubbed his temples, avoiding my eyes. "Not much. A few $100,000, maybe more. It doesn't matter. I'm good for it." I laughed bitterly. "Good for it? You've blown through millions. You're drowning, Michael, and you're dragging me down with you." For once, he had no comeback. He just slumped into a chair, muttering under his breath, shame flickering across his face. That night, as he passed out on the couch, I sat in the dark and made my decision. I couldn't wait any longer. Michael's destruction wasn't just his own anymore. It was mine too. If I stayed, I'd lose everything Edward had entrusted me with. My safety, my sanity, my future. So I began to plan, carefully and quietly. The first step was protection. I met with my lawyer again, this time in a cafe far from the city center. She listened patiently as I explained the visits, the threats, the debts Michael refused to acknowledge. Her eyes hardened. "Samantha, you need to move quickly. Separate your assets, secure what's yours, and prepare to walk away. Men like him don't just collapse, they explode. And you don't want to be standing too close when it happens." Her words were harsh, but they rang true. I nodded. "Then that's what I'll do." We drew up documents. Quiet transfers, protections, legal structures Michael would never see until it was too late. Meanwhile, I played my part at home. To Michael, I was still the silent wife, watching him spiral, offering no resistance. I let him believe I was powerless, just as he always had. But behind the mask, I was moving pieces like a chess player, closing accounts he didn't know existed, locking assets and trusts he couldn't touch, preparing a new life in places he couldn't follow. It was dangerous work. Every phone call, every document signed felt like balancing on a razor's edge. If he discovered what I was doing, I didn't know how he'd react. But the risk of staying still was worse. The debts grew heavier, the men grew bolder. One afternoon, I came home to find Michael shouting into the phone, his face red with rage. "You can't talk to me like that. Do you know who I am?" "I'll have the money, damn it. Just give me another chance." He slammed the phone down and turned to me, wild-eyed. "They're bluffing," he said quickly, as if trying to convince himself. "They won't do anything. They know I'll pay." But I saw the truth in his eyes. He was terrified. And in that moment, I realized something important. Michael wasn't just reckless. He was weak. He always had been. That night, as I lay awake, a strange calm washed over me. For years, I had feared him. His temper, his control, his careless power over my life. But now, watching him unravel, I saw him for what he truly was. Not a man to be feared, but a man to be pitied. The empire he had flaunted was crumbling, and all he could do was drink and gamble, waiting for someone else to save him. And that someone would never be me. The following week, I made my most important move yet. I met with a real estate broker under a false name, touring apartments across town. One, a sleek two-bedroom overlooking the park, felt perfect. Quiet, private, safe. As I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker below, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. I signed the lease that day, using Edward's hidden funds. The keys were pressed into my hand, cool and solid, a symbol of freedom. My escape route was ready. Back at the mansion, Michael's decline accelerated. His clothes grew wrinkled, his face unshaven, his once arrogant posture slouched. He drank more, slept less, and snapped at me for the smallest things. "You're too quiet," he accused one night, his eyes narrowing. "What are you hiding?" I smiled faintly. "Nothing at all." And for once, I wasn't lying. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was preparing. The final straw came days later when the men returned. This time, they didn't knock politely. They banged on the door loud enough to rattle the walls. Michael opened it, trying to project bravado, but I saw the tremor in his hands. The taller man leaned close, his voice low and dangerous. "This is your last warning. Pay or we collect another way." Then, without another word, they left. Michael shut the door and collapsed against it, his face pale. He muttered something about selling another car, maybe even the yacht, but his words sounded hollow, meaningless. And in that moment, I knew. His time was running out, and mine had just begun. The apartment key felt heavy in my hand, a weight that was both literal and symbolic. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I was leaving behind a life I had thought was mine, only to claim something truly my own. I arrived in the evening, the city lights twinkling through the large windows of the modest but elegant two-bedroom space. Furniture was minimal, chosen carefully to make the apartment feel like home without hinting at wealth. A soft beige couch, a small oak dining table, and a few well-placed plants. Nothing extravagant, nothing that could draw attention. I set my suitcase down and breathed in the quiet, the silence that didn't carry the weight of threats, drunken arguments, or financial ruin. For the first time in a long while, I felt safe. Over the next few days, I moved slowly but deliberately. I kept Michael occupied, letting him believe I was still absorbed in the chaos of our shared life. But behind closed doors, I was organizing, securing, and protecting. Bills were redirected. Accounts were split. Sensitive documents were moved to the apartment. And most importantly, I began transferring what Edward had entrusted me with into accounts he could not touch, using the legal structures I'd prepared. It was painstaking work. Every decision had to be precise, calculated, untraceable. One misstep, and Michael might notice. One slip, and the fragile safety I was building could shatter. But I was relentless. Meanwhile, Michael's descent accelerated. He arrived home one night, stumbling through the front door, the faint smell of alcohol clinging to his clothes. "Where's my money?" he slurred, throwing a pile of statements onto the table. I remained calm, sitting across from him, pretending not to notice his desperation. "You need to rest, Michael. You've been overextending yourself." "I need it now." His hands shook as he pointed at the statements. "You don't understand. My debts, my investments. Everything's at risk." And I realized then that Michael was no longer a man in control. The man who had once seemed invincible, the man who had drawn me in with charisma and charm, was gone. In his place was panic, a frightening vulnerability that was oddly liberating for me to witness. I said nothing, letting him vent. I didn't need to argue. The truth was obvious. He had chosen this path himself. In the apartment, I began establishing routines. I cooked simple meals, arranged books and papers, and slowly unpacked the few personal belongings I had been able to rescue. The small rituals of domesticity, making the bed, setting a table, even watering the plants, became grounding acts, tiny affirmations of control in a life that had been spiraling for months. I also began reaching out to old friends I had neglected during the marriage. My phone, once a source of panic and anxiety, became a lifeline. Calls with Jessica, my closest confidant, reminded me that I was not alone. She helped me laugh again, even in small doses, and offered perspective when I doubted myself. Michael's erratic behavior began to affect others too. At work, he became distracted, missing deadlines and making poor decisions. His usual charm turned to defensiveness when questioned, and colleagues whispered about his increasingly reckless choices. Even the neighbors noticed. Packages arrived for luxury items he couldn't afford. Cars were repossessed, and his once neat home became a place of chaos. Ah, yet he still believed he was untouchable. He still believed I was powerless. And that was my advantage. I also began taking steps to reclaim my professional life. The boutique consulting firm I had dreamed of before meeting Michael had been shelved, but now, with the inheritance funds secured and inaccessible to him, I could revive it. I spent evenings drafting business plans, researching the market, and reaching out to contacts I had maintained quietly over the years. My experience in marketing and finance was still sharp. My knowledge hadn't disappeared with the collapse of my marriage. It was exhilarating to remember that I had a life and a career that were entirely my own. One morning, while reviewing the apartment's secure files, I received a call that made my stomach tighten. "Miss Wilson?" said the voice on the line. "This is Thomas Bernard." I froze. Michael's attorney. My pulse quickened. I hadn't expected contact from him now that Michael was spiraling. "I'm calling regarding Mr. Lawson's trust and the recent financial arrangements." I kept my voice steady. "I'm aware of your involvement. If this is about Michael, I suggest you direct any inquiries to him. I am no longer participating in his financial decisions." There was a pause on the other end. Then finally, a clipped, professional tone. "Very well." Even that brief exchange reminded me of the life I had escaped, the control he still tried to wield, and the importance of my next moves. By the end of the week, my escape plan was fully in motion. The apartment was settled, the funds were secure, and Michael had no knowledge of the steps I had taken. I felt a sense of calm determination I hadn't experienced in years. I even began small acts of rebellion. One morning, I returned home with a new laptop and a stack of textbooks on finance, management, and entrepreneurship. Michael didn't notice. They were hidden in the apartment, part of the private life I was building for myself. It felt like reclaiming my identity, piece by piece. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected opportunity arrived. A former client of mine, now running a small but growing business, contacted me for advice. The trust I had built professionally and personally gave me credibility. I realized I could offer real value, independent of Michael, independent of the inheritance. I accepted the engagement. Small, cautious, but meaningful. For the first time in months, I felt competence replace fear, and pride replace anxiety. The consulting firm would start small, yes, but it would be mine entirely. And Michael, oblivious and unraveling, could not touch it. By the second month in the apartment, I was no longer the woman waiting for Michael's next move. I was the woman planning her future, shaping her destiny. The quiet strength that had lain dormant under years of compromise, manipulation, and fear was finally awake. I began journaling again, documenting steps, victories, and challenges. The process itself was therapeutic, each page a testament to the autonomy I had fought to reclaim. One evening, as I gazed out at the city skyline from my apartment, I allowed myself a rare smile. Michael was losing his empire, his control, and his illusions of grandeur. I was building mine. Not a mansion, not a fortune, but a life defined by my choices, my knowledge, and my resilience. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of my apartment, casting stripes across the wooden floor. I sat at my small oak table, laptop open, coffee steaming beside me. My consulting firm was no longer just a plan. It was alive. I had secured my first paying client, and though the contract was modest, it was a validation I had craved for years. I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. This was mine, not borrowed, not inherited, not tied to anyone else's success or failure. Meanwhile, Michael's life outside my apartment was a living chaos. I didn't need to hear every detail to know it. Rumors spread quickly in our circle. Luxury cars were being repossessed, exclusive events attended and abandoned, and debts accumulating faster than he could manage. Friends who once called him regularly now ignored his messages. One afternoon, I got a notification from a mutual acquaintance. Michael had shown up at an investment seminar, attempting to secure a deal that even he couldn't afford. The humiliation was subtle but undeniable. He was a man drowning, and the more he flailed, the clearer it became that the support system he had relied on was gone. I felt no satisfaction in watching his downfall, only relief that I was no longer entangled in it. Back in my apartment, the days passed in a mix of structured routine and unplanned creativity. I scheduled client meetings in my living room, laid out financial models on the dining table, and began mapping the first official services my consulting firm would offer. I also began a small marketing campaign, reaching out to local small businesses who needed guidance with budgeting, planning, and sustainable growth. I tapped into my professional network quietly, letting my reputation carry more weight than flashy advertising. By midweek, I had my first 3 paying clients lined up, all of whom had heard about me through personal recommendations. Each call and meeting strengthened my confidence. This was no longer about survival, it was about creating a legacy. Michael's presence loomed, however, despite the distance. One evening, while reviewing quarterly financial statements for a client, I received a text message from an unknown number. The message was short, ominous. "We need to talk. Now." My pulse quickened, but I remained calm. I did not reply immediately. I knew his tactics well enough to understand that responding impulsively would play into his hands. Instead, I took a deep breath and continued working. I was no longer the woman who had panicked when Michael demanded attention or obedience. I was in control of my reactions. The next day brought another surprise. Jessica called me, her voice sharp with concern. "Samantha, he's been asking around about you. At work, at the apartment building, he's trying to find out where you're going, who you're meeting." I felt a flicker of unease, quickly replaced by resolve. I had anticipated this. It was the predictable desperation of a man who had lost both control and wealth. "We'll keep things professional," I replied. "No contact, no confrontation. Just document everything. That's our best protection." Jessica sighed. "You're handling this better than I ever could." I smiled softly. "I've had a lot of practice." As my consulting firm grew, so did my independence. I secured office space downtown, hired 2 assistants with complementary skills, and began creating workshops for small business owners. I designed a curriculum focusing on financial literacy, risk assessment, and sustainable growth, lessons I had learned the hard way. I realized, almost with a sense of irony, that the very skills I had used to support Michael and maintain our household were now the foundation for my success. The knowledge I had built quietly over years became a tangible, marketable asset. Meanwhile, Michael's desperation escalated into reckless behavior. I learned through mutual contacts that he had spent an extraordinary sum on a luxury condo he could not afford, taken out multiple high-interest loans, and attempted a series of business deals that collapsed within days. Friends who had once shielded him from consequences began distancing themselves. He was unraveling publicly while I continued to build privately. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. Then, one afternoon, a call came that would force our paths to intersect. "Miss Wilson," the voice said, "this is Walter Green. There's been a development regarding Michael and some of the financial missteps he's made. We need to discuss strategy to protect your interests." I felt a surge of relief. Walter's presence was a stabilizing force, a reminder that I had allies who understood the legal and financial terrain better than I ever could alone. "Of course," I said, voice steady. "Let's meet tomorrow." That evening, I reflected on the journey so far. The betrayal, the financial manipulation, the emotional abuse. It all felt like a distant storm now, something I had weathered and survived. I realized that my growth, my reclaiming of autonomy, and the foundation I was building for my consulting firm were not just professional achievements. They were acts of personal liberation. I could see the irony clearly now. Michael had been convinced that his wealth, his charm, and his manipulations could control outcomes. But it was my consistency, knowledge, and foresight that had truly secured the future. The next morning, I met Walter at his office. He had prepared detailed records of Michael's recent financial moves, mismanaged investments, unpaid debts, and failed business ventures. This is why we structured the trust the way we did, Walter explained. Michael's impulsive spending, combined with his disregard for the legal conditions, gives you complete leverage. He cannot challenge the trust without significant legal risk to himself. I listened, feeling a mixture of vindication and cautious relief. The law was finally on my side. Armed with this knowledge, I began setting boundaries. No more reactive measures, no more anxiety-driven decisions. Every communication from Michael would be filtered, every move anticipated. I began documenting every interaction, every incident of attempted contact or harassment. This was not just legal protection. It was reclaiming power that had been denied to me for years. Back at the office, my small team gathered around a whiteboard, brainstorming solutions for a client struggling with cash flow. The energy in the room was tangible, ideas flowed freely, and I felt a sense of purpose I had not experienced in years. Michael's chaos existed in a separate world, irrelevant to my current reality. I had learned that control over my life did not require controlling him. It only required me to act decisively, protectively, and with foresight. By the end of the week, my consulting firm had taken on a new client, bringing revenue that covered our initial operating expenses and allowed for small investments in marketing. I allowed myself a quiet celebration, pouring a glass of tea and looking out at the skyline. For the first time, I was not just surviving. I was thriving. Michael, meanwhile, was unraveling under the weight of his own impulses, his desperation growing daily. And I knew deep down that the day would come when he would realize just how thoroughly he had lost control. But that day, I decided, would not involve me. I would not participate in his unraveling, only witness it from a position of strength. The morning air carried a chill, but inside my apartment, the atmosphere was warm with purpose. I had spent the previous night finalizing client contracts and scheduling workshops for my new consulting firm, and the satisfaction of seeing plans take shape was invigorating. The small downtown office I had rented was finally ready, with minimalist decor, a whiteboard for brainstorming sessions, and an energy that made each decision feel consequential. I pored over the week's agenda, reviewing client profiles, preparing presentation materials, and cross-referencing financial models. The work was demanding, but it was mine, built on years of expertise that Michael had once dismissed. The first official client meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. The client, a boutique bakery struggling with cash flow and inventory management, arrived promptly. I greeted the owner warmly, and we spent the next 2 hours dissecting every aspect of her business. From supplier negotiations to staffing schedules, we created a plan that balanced profitability with sustainability. As I handed her the detailed report, I realized the enormity of what I was doing. I was not just advising a client, I was reshaping the trajectory of their business. And for the first time in years, I felt a surge of authentic pride. Not the fleeting recognition that came from supporting Michael, but real, tangible accomplishment that belonged solely to me. Meanwhile, Michael's world was deteriorating rapidly. I learned through whispers in professional circles that his lavish lifestyle had begun to attract scrutiny. Missed payments, repossessed vehicles, and failed business ventures were no longer isolated incidents. They were patterning into a narrative of instability. Friends who had once shielded him from consequences were now stepping back, unwilling to risk their own reputations. The contrast between our realities was almost surreal. While I was methodically building, he was careening into chaos. And this time, I felt no pang of guilt. This was the natural consequence of choices he had made repeatedly, despite opportunities to act responsibly. Midweek, a new challenge arrived, an unexpected legal notice. Walter Green called, his tone calm but firm. "Samantha, Michael has attempted to contest a small clause in the trust, claiming it was unfair. He's hoping to delay your control over the funds." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. I expected something like this. "What's our course of action?" Walter reassured me. "We respond swiftly, with documentation. His claim has no merit and the law is firmly on your side. But be prepared. He will try various tactics to create obstacles." I nodded. I had anticipated this. Not because I wanted conflict, but because I had learned that people like Michael often reacted to losing control with desperation. That evening, I gathered my team for a strategy session. We need to be meticulous, I said, outlining the legal situation, potential business risks, and the immediate goals for the next quarter. Our priority is stability, for the firm and for our clients. Michael's actions will not distract us from the work we are building. My assistants, Clara and James, exchanged determined glances. I could sense their confidence in me, and it bolstered my own. For the first time, leadership did not feel like an obligation. It felt natural, a role I had been preparing for without realizing it. The following days were a whirlwind of client meetings, legal consultations, and planning sessions. One morning, a delivery arrived at the office, a carefully packaged gift of flowers and a note. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Samantha, please meet me. I need to explain." And ma'am, I stared at the note for a moment, heart rate quickening. Then I calmly placed it in a drawer and instructed my assistant not to open it. No response. No engagement. I had learned that my time, energy, and emotions were valuable commodities, not to be spent on someone who had repeatedly undermined my well-being. That night, as I reviewed client feedback, I reflected on the journey so far. 7 years of a marriage that had demanded every ounce of my patience, expertise, and financial acumen had ended in betrayal. Yet in the months since, I had discovered not only resilience, but also clarity. I understood my worth, the value of my expertise, and the necessity of boundaries. Michael's attempts to reconnect, to manipulate, or to regain control would fail, not because of malice, but because I had finally learned to prioritize myself. A breakthrough came in the form of a high-profile client. A local startup, a small tech company struggling to organize their financial operations, reached out after hearing of my boutique consulting firm. Their budget was substantial, allowing me to hire additional support, upgrade software, and implement more robust systems. The first strategy session with the startup's founders was electric. I guided them through cash flow projections, expense analysis, and strategic planning for future growth. By the end of the session, they were eager to sign a 3-month retainer. This moment was a turning point. I realized that the work I had postponed for years was now unfolding, fully supported by my expertise and vision. I did not need Michael's approval, validation, or partnership. The path forward was mine alone. But Michael did not stay silent. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that he had confronted a potential client of mine, attempting to discredit my reputation and undermine my growing business. I felt a flicker of anger, quickly replaced by focus. I documented the incident and instructed Walter to handle any necessary legal communication. My response was measured, calm, professional, and unwavering. I would not be drawn into drama. I would respond only when necessary, with evidence and strategy. Amid the professional whirlwind, personal growth continued. Therapy sessions with Dr. Larson had evolved from trauma processing to empowerment coaching. I learned to recognize manipulative patterns, trust my instincts, and establish boundaries. I began journaling daily, meditating to maintain clarity, and setting deliberate goals for both business and personal development. Through these practices, I noticed subtle but profound changes. My posture was more confident, my speech more deliberate, and my capacity to make decisions without hesitation improved dramatically. I was no longer defined by the past, but guided by purpose. One evening, as I walked home from a late meeting, I realized how much I had shifted. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the city hummed around me. For years, I had measured success by others' standards, by Michael's expectations, societal norms, or temporary gains. Now, success was internal. It was measured in autonomy, clarity, and the ability to effect positive change for myself and others. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction that no amount of money could provide. Later that week, I received a formal communication from Walter confirming the trust provisions were secure. Michael's contestation had been dismissed, and the funds were now legally under my control. For a moment, I let myself imagine the freedom the trust offered. Not indulgence or extravagance, but opportunity. Opportunity to create, to build, to invest wisely, and to leave a legacy aligned with my values. By the end of the month, my firm had grown steadily, gaining a reputation for professionalism, insight, and measurable results. Clients referred me to others, and the momentum felt unstoppable. Michael, conversely, had begun to fade from the periphery. His reckless decisions, failed ventures, and dwindling reputation meant that his presence in my world was no longer a constant threat. I realized with a sense of deep satisfaction that independence did not require his downfall. It only required my consistency, resilience, and vision. The city skyline glittered through the office window as I finished the last edits on a client proposal. A year had passed since the divorce, and yet the memories of betrayal still lingered, sharp, like shards of glass tucked into the corners of my mind. But each day they dulled slightly, replaced by the tangible evidence of my resilience. The consulting firm I had envisioned in college was no longer just a dream. It was thriving, staffed by capable colleagues, and attracting clients who trusted not just my skills, but my judgment. Walter Green had remained a steady presence, guiding me through the legal intricacies of the trust. Michael's attempts to challenge it had fizzled under scrutiny, and the court had affirmed the conditional clauses as ironclad. Any lingering threat from him had evaporated, leaving only the freedom to chart my own path. I found it remarkable how swiftly the chaos of the past could be replaced by order when boundaries were clearly set and enforced. That morning, I had a meeting scheduled with a young entrepreneur named Elise. She ran a small business selling eco-friendly home goods, but had been struggling to scale operations efficiently. The session was invigorating. Together, we restructured her finances, organized her supply chain, and developed a realistic growth strategy. At the end of the session, she looked at me, eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've changed the way I see my business and myself." Her words resonated deeply. Helping others succeed had become more than a professional goal. It had become my purpose. Unlike the wealth Michael had squandered, this work was creating tangible, lasting impact. It affirmed that my value was not dependent on anyone's validation, especially not someone who had once betrayed me. Later that afternoon, I returned home to my modest apartment, its simplicity a balm to my mind. I brewed tea and settled into my favorite chair, reflecting on how drastically my life had shifted. 7 years of a marriage defined by manipulation and financial imbalance had ended in betrayal, yet from that upheaval I had built a life of autonomy and fulfillment. The irony was not lost on me. Michael had believed discarding me would secure his freedom and fortune, but in doing so, he had released me to claim both my independence and the inheritance that rightfully reflected my years of patience, diligence, and wisdom. The phone rang, and I hesitated before answering. It was Michael. "Please, Samantha," he said, voice trembling. "I need to talk." I felt a flicker of old tension, but maintained my composure. "Michael, I suggest you speak with Walter if it's about legal matters. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss." There was silence on the line, then a soft sigh. I just... I wanted to apologize. I was wrong. I see that now. I nodded, though he could not see me. "Your apology is noted, but the past cannot be undone, and my life moves forward." That was all I needed to say. Michael's attempts to reconcile emotionally held no power over me anymore. I had claimed control of my life, my work, and my financial destiny. That control was non-negotiable, and the peace it brought was invaluable. In the following weeks, I began implementing plans for the Harold Wilson Foundation, honoring the legacy of the man who had seen my true worth long before anyone else. Scholarships for young women pursuing business degrees, mentorship programs for budding entrepreneurs, and financial literacy workshops became my focus. I wanted to create opportunities that extended beyond myself, transforming wealth into empowerment for others. As I spoke at the foundation's launch, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Financial independence is more than money, I told the audience. It's the knowledge, the confidence, and the freedom to make choices aligned with your values. It's about resilience and self-respect. It's about creating impact beyond yourself. Applause echoed through the hall, but more than the sound, it was the reality of the work itself that satisfied me. The foundation was not just a project. It was the embodiment of the lessons learned from betrayal, resilience, and the pursuit of authenticity. That evening, I met with Jessica for dinner. She had been my unwavering support throughout the storm, the person who had held me together when everything else seemed to collapse. We laughed, shared updates about clients, and discussed plans for the Foundation's first mentorship retreat. Look at you, she said with a smile. You're thriving, not just surviving. You've built something incredible from everything Michael thought would break you. I smiled back, feeling a quiet pride that had nothing to do with wealth. It's not just about me. It's about the people I can help, the impact I can make, and the life I can finally claim as my own. The final test of closure came unexpectedly. I was walking through the local park one morning when I noticed Michael sitting on a bench, alone. He looked older, more worn, a stark contrast to the man who had once flaunted wealth and arrogance. Our eyes met briefly. He rose, hesitated, then nodded in acknowledgement before walking away without a word. It was a moment of quiet resolution. There was no anger, no confrontation, only recognition that the chapter had ended. The past existed, but it no longer controlled me. I continued my walk, breathing deeply, feeling an unfamiliar lightness. That night, as I journaled, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 7 years of marriage filled with devotion, betrayal, and resilience. The loss and grief that followed Harold Wilson's passing. Michael's sudden transformation into someone I scarcely recognized. The legal battles, the heartbreak, and the eventual triumph through the trust. Building a business from scratch and creating a philanthropic legacy. Each step had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I realized that worth is not determined by someone else's approval or a marriage's outcome. It is measured by integrity, persistence, and the ability to create meaning from adversity. I looked out at the city from my apartment window, lights twinkling like distant stars. The journey was far from over. New clients awaited guidance, the Foundation's programs were just beginning, and life, unpredictable and full of possibility, stretched ahead. But for the first time, I felt fully equipped to navigate it on my own terms. The betrayal that once threatened to define me had become a catalyst for growth. The inheritance that had seemed like a test of loyalty had proven to be a vehicle for empowerment. And the lessons I had learned, the value of boundaries, resilience, and authenticity, would remain with me forever. I closed the journal, a gentle smile on my lips. For Samantha Wilson, life was no longer about surviving someone else's choices. It was about thriving because of my own.